Welcome to this latest episode in Shakespeare Martino's Energy White Paper series. Today, Toby Heyshaml, Director of Pinnacle Power, gives us his views on the white paper. Toby, thank you so much for joining us. I wonder firstly if you can tell us a bit about the work that Pinnacle Power is doing in the energy sector.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. So we build, own and operate the generation and distribution of energy networks. So the main thrust of that is heat networks, if I'm 100% honest. That does include a bit of private wire, because increasingly we're seeing a lot of private wire being relevant in decentralized energy. But we're really looking to design and build, operate and maintain, guys out there with spanners maintaining kit. And then we have a utility looking after customers who are on heat networks, as well as owning it where appropriate. On the owning side, that's either done in conjunction with someone else, i.e. the local authority, developer, or we can own outright, or we can operate where appropriate. People want to own it themselves.
And Toby, on a lot of these networks, would you say they're mostly gas CHP run?
So no, I suppose I would say. They are now, but all the ones going forward are looking probably to not be. So gas-fired CHP is been very clearly stated not to be the future. So when we look at the future, we're looking at waste heat. So waste heat from a power plant, or waste heat from anything else, or we're looking at electrified heat, so heat pumps. And when looking backwards, yes, CHP. Looking forwards, no.
And so what do you think would be the challenges that the industry would face in transitioning from, say, gas CHP schemes to electric heat pumps?
Yeah, great question. Well, I'll split this answer into two. There's technical challenges and then there's commercial challenges. So the technical ones are heat pumps like to operate at a slightly lower temperature than gas-fired CHP. And that can be managed a bit in new build schemes, because you can design the whole system, which really comes back to the radiators that someone has, all the way back into the engine center to cope with the lower temperatures. So difficult but doable. On retrofit, buildings have been designed to run at a particular temperature, and the retrofit environment is the area of biggest growth in the heat network sector, particularly in the UK. And so a building needs a certain amount of heat, and if you turn the temperature down, it won't work. So you can either increase the temperature in the heat pump, and so it needs more design work, and the heat pump manufacturers are doing a lot of work on that, or you can reduce the temperature in the building, which is quite difficult. So I would say the biggest area on that is definitely temperatures. From a commercial perspective, the cost of heat is higher from heat pumps at the moment. And so I think if you were to wrap it into a really sort of meaty answer, the real answer is that we need to have a decarbonized counterfactual, so a low-cost heating counterfactual, rather than comparing against gas. If we go into 2050 comparing all of our heating against gas, we'll firstly have high carbon, and secondly have no uptake in low-carbon heating. And so we need to be comparing apples with apples, which is low-carbon heat with low-carbon heat, not a low-carbon with high-carbon.
That's very interesting. And the Energy White Paper also talks about increasing the amount of green gas in the grid and the development of clean hydrogen in order to decarbonize heating in the UK. What do you think would be some of the issues the industry would face in sort of converting schemes currently run on gas to green gas and hydrogen?
Yeah, so my take on this is that in order for hydrogen to work as a clean fuel, you have to have a ton of renewable power coming in. So the way the Energy White Paper looks to do it, I think, is increase the size of the offshore wind capacity by 4. Yeah. So it's a fairly major step change to make that work. Now, in my view, that the first place to put that hydrogen would be in transport. It would seem the most sensible thing. However, I can see an argument for running it into a gas grid as well. The way the heat market is evolving and developing suggests that there will be heat zones for heat networks in dense urban environments, and and there will be areas in which they try and decarbonize a different way using heat pumps, or maybe, and this is where I think it's a big maybe, that you run hydrogen into a specific local grid.
So
I don't think there's. Say it again, sorry.
Sorry, so you have hydrogen hubs separate from the heat network zones.
So I think they are discrete things, and the hydrogen hubs would be in an area which are dispersed, where there's no big pump velocities, there's no big problems happening there. So I think they're sort of separate places. I think there's very, very little point running hydrogen or any other biomethane into a gas-fired CHP, because by the time we get there, it'll be commercially not possible anyway. So I would be expecting to see heat network zones operating here, and those heat network zones, I think, will be really playing on the balancing, the imbalance, I should say, we're getting in the electrical grid. So we should all be installing effectively immersion heaters in our thermal stores. So we've got big tanks which we can heat up like a kettle the minute that the power price drops below zero or drops low. And we really want to be playing that grid imbalance carefully enough. But I think hydrogen should be kept separate and should be used in more dispersed environments. Long rambling answer, I hope that answers.
And what do you think, as someone operating in the industry, of the government consultation which came out last year on this proposal to shift from a sort of voluntary heat trust scheme for protecting heat customers to a licensing regime administered by Ofgem?
So the industry has always been keen on a licensing, or even better, I would go so far as to say regulated environment for heat networks. It's a weakness we have, and it's not a weakness we want. I sit on the Heat Network Industry Council trying to do a sector deal with government, and one of the main things we want is regulation. So it's a complete fallacy for people to suggest that we are anti-regulation. The challenge is getting it right, and the challenge, to my mind, is to see a heat network a bit like a power network. So regulating in a way which allows multiple generation sources to come into an energy network, into a decentralized heat network, and then multiple suppliers to come off it the other side. That's difficult because if you focus entirely on the consumer, I think you miss the point of the bulk of what a heat network does. So a consumer typically in a heat network is on what we call a secondary system. So the heat network comes up to a building, goes into the basement, and then you have a series of pipes which take it up to a series of consumers in, say, a block of flats or something like that. And that's where the bulk of the issues in heat networks happen, is in those secondary systems. But to confuse that with the core driver, which is to take low carbon heat and run it around a town, would be a shame. So I hope they really think about how to encourage more generators onto the network, how to encourage more off-takers onto a network, and how to look at a network as basically a big pipe which takes hot water around it. Yeah. And that would be a real challenge.
And so, given that the government is meant to come out imminently with a heat and building strategy, what would you, as an industry player, like to see in that strategy?
So I think a lot is the short answer, but and I suppose the biggest one, particularly on the back of the white paper, is for heat networks and low carbon heat to be taken a lot more seriously. I think I was a bit disappointed with the lack of heat networks referenced in the 10-point plan. It's not particularly heavily referenced in the energy white paper, and so I would like to heat networks to be front and center as one of the core ways to decentralize the dense urban environments. On a more sort of detailed point, I'd personally like to see them separate primary networks, so the networks I talk running around in a town or an estate, to secondary networks, which is going up and down a block of flats.
Yes.
By way of example, in London, the London planning policy has suggested that you have to have what's called communal networks, which are these secondary networks, for the last about 10 years. And that's what really needs focused on, those secondary networks, because they're not working well enough, and they're not being built well enough, and they're not being taken seriously well enough. So what should we do there? I think we should be working very, very hard with MHCLG to make sure that the built environment, those buildings, are built properly. The secondary networks are built properly, and there's a lot of work to be done on that. Next one I would be really keen to see would be a low carbon heat counterfactual we talked about earlier. So referencing the fact that this is a low carbon building, and that means your heat cost is compared to other low carbon sources.
Yeah.
And then I thought I'd add in sort of, if there was a big bold thing, which is not, it absolutely won't come out in the buildings heat building strategy, but I'll say it anyway. I would love to see what I call a falling block levy. So at the moment, people don't want to connect onto heat networks necessarily because they can be on gas. People think to themselves, okay, why should I bother? So if you were to say the biggest users pay a levy to be on those gas networks, a green levy, coming down to the smallest users, you would encourage big gas users to go into heat network zones.
Yes.
That's what is going to happen. These heat network zones are critical, and that's what I would really like to see.
So you've almost got to make the price of gas go up so that people then move towards having electric heat pumps being more palatable for them.
Or waste heat.
Yes, or waste heat, yes. Well, Toby, thank you so much for joining us today and talking to us about your views on the Energy White Paper. And we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.